Erev Tov again, everybody. We are already at Parashat Yitro, zipping along through Sefer Shemot, and this essay is entitled "Honoring Parents." I'm going to make note of the fact that my parents are here, so uh, it's we call applied wisdom in this personal case. I've also had Shira and I both have had the privilege over this fall semester, which has concluded, to participate in a chabura, community chabura, with Rabbi Linzer, learning some of the Gemaras and general rabbinic worldview of the mitzvah of kibbud av v'em. It really is a fascinating area. The vast majority of the 2 pages or so of Gemara, from which Rav Shai quotes at the beginning, the vast majority are Agadic texts. And so it's a really interesting area to try to parse out the halacha, the values, the conflicts. And this is the kind of essay where Rav Shai stakes out some of the different dimensions of the mitzvah, and as he's wont to do, sort of brings it home to a particular dimension at the end. I don't think it's the kind of essay that sort of builds one step to another in quite a straightforward way, but builds some different building blocks, and then concludes with what feels to him to be the most salient point or idea within kibbud av v'em. Last year or the year before, on Shabbat Parashat Yitro, I argued that the most challenging mitzvah of the Ten Commandments was lo tachmod, not to covet what other people have, but that honoring our parents comes at least a close second, and sometimes maybe is the hardest. So glad to be delving into his analysis of this. Okay, Yitro essay number 2. We have a series of next few weeks where we're learning essay number 2 of the 2 essays on the Parashah from Rav Shai. So this is Yitro essay number 2, honoring parents, sometimes the hardest mitzvah of all. The 5th of the 10 commandments reads, honor, kabed, your father and mother, that you may long endure on the land that the Lord your God is giving to you. From our Parashah, from the Aseret HaDvarim, Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. Noting that we are commanded to honor both our parents and God, the Talmud concludes that Scripture equates the honor due parents with the honor due to God. And yet the parameters of the obligation are not obvious. What is required by the commandment and what isn't? And perhaps most significant, what is it about our own time that makes honoring parents at once especially challenging and especially urgent? He's really going to come around to this question at the end. The Hebrew word for honor, kabed, also means to be heavy, suggesting that what is commanded is for people to, quote, give weight to their parents, to regard them as of high value or worth. The commandment's negative counterpart is linguistically parallel. One who curses mikalel, his father or his mother, shall be put to death. The Hebrew word for curse or dishonor, kuf lamed lamed, also means to be light. So the thrust of the Torah's teaching is clear. Do not make light of your parents, but give them weight and treat them with appropriate seriousness. This is a nice textual point of Rav Shai's, to hold kabed along with lo tekalel, or mikalel, as the opposite, and see the semantic relationship as about this relationship between heaviness, seriousness, and lightness or, dismissiveness. Neither Exodus nor Deuteronomy, meaning the 2 places where the commandment to honor our parents appear, neither Exodus nor Deuteronomy fleshes out precisely what honoring parents requires. Through careful readings of other biblical passages about filial duty, some scholars attempt to construct at least a partial picture. And here, really, he's, collecting from more modern commentaries. The Gemara does not quote most of these passages in its discussion about Kabed et avicha ve'et imecha. So these are scholars sort of saying, what else can we glean from other biblical texts, less than a focus on the rabbinic development of the mitzvah, starting off by saying, well, what other attitudes or behaviors towards parents are indicated in the Torah or in Tanakh itself. Heed, my son, the discipline of your father, and do not forsake the instruction of your mother, from Proverbs, suggests a mandate to adhere to parental teachings. Laws in Parashat Mishpatim make clear that striking or insulting a parent are strongly prohibited. Misappropriating parental property is vigorously condemned, also from Mishlei. He who robs his father and mother and says it is no offense is a companion to vandals. Moreover, as we see in Psalms 91:15, honoring has nuances of caring for and showing affection. In general, we're still kind of gleaning from modern commentaries and the way they distill biblical texts. In general, Bible scholar Brevard Childs notes, the choice of the word honor carries with it a range of connotations far broader than some such term as obey. The Torah's intention is thus to expand the area covered by the commandment as widely as possible. In a related vein, Terence Fretheim, we've seen a lot of quotes from him, suggests that the Torah's use of a wide-ranging verb like honor means that there is no one specific behavior that is commanded. It is an open-ended commandment, inviting children to respond in any way that honors parents. In all dealings with parents, respect, esteem, having regard and concern for, and showing affection, considerateness, and appreciation are the order of the day. Right? So here, a reading of kabed as a sort of broad verb, which allows for, or invites, expects a lot more than just listening to, but a whole host of frameworks for relationship. Modern scholars disagree over whether honoring parents entails obeying them, right? So having said that, kabed as opposed to shema b'kol or something like that, so could it be that honoring is a whole framework, but doesn't actually include specifically the mandate to do whatever they say? Jeffrey Teague, for example, writes that one aspect of honoring is respect, which includes obedience to parents. And Richard Nelson adds that to honor in this context means to submit appropriately to authority. Walter Brueggemann, on the other hand, argues that the command does not advocate obeying or being subordinate, and Terence Fretheim avers that for the Torah, obedience is not at the center of what it means to honor. So we can already see a kind of scatter plot here from, even though the verb is kabed, it obviously implies or subsumes obeying in it, to that may be part of it, but that's not the center, to that's not really related to the mitzvah of honoring one's parents at all. It does not imply specifically an aspect of obedience. Still, other scholars insist that to pose such a question to the fifth commandment is, quote, asking too much of it. Peter Enns, for example, maintains that the Ten Commandments are consistently ambiguous and suggests that this is not just the case for us, but for the ancient Israelites themselves. On Enns' account, the purpose of the Ten Commandments is to reveal to the Israelites a bit of who God is, knowledge that must translate into appropriate behavior on their part. In other words, as glimpses into the nature of God and God's relationship with God's people, the Ten Commandments are not exhaustive pieces of legislation that account for each and every contingency and possibility. They are to be obeyed, but as to how, that is a matter of continual reflection by the Israelites as they continue to live and grow in the shadow of God's love and protection. So that's just sort of, again, I think this is independent of how we see rabbinic literature develop it, just to look and say, okay, what are the Ten Commandments setting out for us? They're setting out some scaffolding for this relationship that we have to our parents, but intentionally not being exhaustive, so that we continue to apply, update, to, to our developing relationship with God and with the world. And yet, so this has been, maybe one of the longest sections in which we've seen Rav Shai kind of survey the modern scholars, not from the kind of traditional Jewish canon, to really stay in the biblical framework at first. And now we come to the more traditional rabbinic and halachic dimensions. And yet, halakha, Jewish law, always seeks concrete applications, lest divine commands remain at the level of abstraction or even platitude. Accordingly, the sages ask, what is meant by reverence, mora, right? Because we have kabed avicha v'timecha, and we also have ish imo v'aviv tira'u. One, a person shall revere or have awe for their mother and father. So the Gemara wants to know, how do we, how do we kind of develop and make practical these two regulating, controlling verbs, have reverence for and honor. So what is meant by reverence? One should not sit in the parent's place or speak in their presence or contradict their words. What is meant by honor? Kibud. One should feed them and give them drink, help them get dressed, welcome them when they come home, and escort them when they go out. Strikingly, so this is the Sifra from Kedoshim, and the Gemara says something very, very similar there in Kiddushin, around page 31 or so. Strikingly, nothing is said here about an obligation to obey one's parents. Again, Rav Shai is back to this kind of defining question. Okay, there are so many aspects to kibud av v'em, but what about literally following what your parents say? This leaves the interpreter to make a judgment. Does such an obligation not exist in halakha? Or conversely, is its existence so self-evident that it does not need explicit mention, right? This is not in every case, but in many cases, one can ask this question, right? The same thing comes around. Is there a mitzvah to believe in God? Is that what, the first commandment really is or not? Even the debate about whether there's a mitzvah to settle in the land of Israel, right? These are things which some people say, like, yes, it is there in the text, and some people say, no, it's not there. No, it's not there, but it's obviously subsumed somehow under a mitzvah, or no, it's not there, and actually that means it's not its own mitzvah, even if it's a value or, part of our overall set of expectations. So what about obeying? Is it kind of obviously implied or not actually a part of the mitzvah or a formal expectation at all? One thing at any rate is clear. Parents cannot demand that their child sin. Commenting on the mandate in Leviticus, right, as what we referenced before, ish imo v'aviv tira'u, and then it continues, vet shabtotai tishmoru, ani Hashem Elokeichem. You shall each revere his mother and father, and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. A midrash asks, could it be that if one's father or mother instructed one to transgress one of the commandments in the Torah, one should obey them? That's why scripture says, and keep my Sabbaths. You are all obligated to honor me. Kulchem chayavim bichvodi, is what the Midrash says, right? So yes, we're seeing a kind of a stepwise set of increasingly superseding obligations, right? Yes, honor your mother and father. But even more than that, follow the commandments given to us by God. And if those two things come in conflict, doing what your father or mother say and doing what God says, follow God's commands, because everybody is subject to that kind of final culminating phrase, I am the Lord your God. So if we're all subject to I am the Lord your God, then we all have to follow what I am the Lord your God says, even if it's against what a father or mother says. And indeed, the central code of Jewish law unequivocally insists that if his father told him to violate the words of Torah, whether a positive commandment or a negative one, even of rabbinic status, he should not obey him. And maybe this is completely obvious to us, and maybe what's kind of actually remarkable is that this needs to be said, right? That, we even entertain the possibility, right? It gives an indication of how powerful honoring our parents is as an obligation that we even could think to ourselves for a second. Well, so if your parents tell you to transgress a commandment of the Torah, then maybe you should listen to them. The answer is no, but we entertain the possibility as a way of showing how serious honoring our parents is. A child's sense of how to best fulfill his religious obligations is also enough to override his parents' express wishes. As Rav Yosef Karo puts it, and the author of the Shulchan Aruch, if a student wishes to move to another place where he is certain that he will benefit greatly from the rabbis there, meaning studying with those rabbis as teachers, and his father forbids him to go because he, his father, is worried about possible deeds of idolaters there, this having to do with the fact that maybe the other nations could harm or endanger or cause risk to the child who says, I want to go to such and such place and study with the teachers there. The father says, but the idolaters there, are dangerous for you. He need not abide by his father's wishes, right? The child can go follow his desire to study Torah in the way that will be best for him, even as against his parents' wishes. So also, if a person wants to pray in a synagogue where prayers are offered with greater devotion, he may do so even against his parents' wishes, right? And here they're not even asking you to transgress a commandment. They're just asking you to not fulfill a commandment in the way that seems best to you, and you don't have to follow their wishes in that regard. One could argue that in such cases, the issue is a conflict between religious obligations, honoring parents on one hand, and other religious requirements on the other. But a number of Jewish legal sources open the door wider, indicating that parents cannot thwart their child's subjective sense of well-being. Rav Moshe Isserlis, the Ramaz, Ashkenazic glosses on the Shulchan Aruch, for example, writes that if a father forbids his son to marry the wife of his choice, the son can disregard the father's instructions. More generally, a parent cannot demand that one's children carry the parent's grudges indefinitely. If a father commanded his son not to speak to a particular person, nor to forgive him until after a certain time, if the son wishes to make up with that person immediately, despite the father's command, he may disregard the command. And these sources in the Shulchan Aruch are mostly applications of rabbinic responsa from the medieval period, where these questions were asked in a whole host of different contexts, and they made their way into broader halachic literature and got codified by the Shulchan Aruch. All kinds of fascinating, cases discussed in the literature. In general, some of the most significant medieval rabbinic decisors seem to have held that there is no blanket obligation for a child to obey his or her parents. Obedience, they argue, is simply not what the Torah means by honor. It is crucial to emphasize this distinction between honor and obedience, because relations between parents and children can easily run aground when the two are conflated. Narcissistic parents tend to see their children as mere extensions of their will. When children begin to chafe under that unbearable burden, entire families can begin to unravel. Needless to say, no one emerges from such a process feeling that his or her dignity is fully intact. All of this points to a more fundamental fact about the fifth commandment. The contours of what honor requires in specific situations can be enormously difficult to discern, and fulfilling those obligations can be just as, if not more, difficult. Not surprisingly, a Talmudic sage teaches that the commandment to honor our parents is the most difficult one to fulfill, right? And here it seems like it's saying not just most difficult to fulfill because it demands the most of our resources, but because it can be so idiosyncratic in a certain way and hard to actually parse out sometimes. And also because sometimes it can be enormously demanding of our resources, or even of our resources, material or psychological. The Gemara does talk about the idea that that at a certain level, the material obligations to honor our parents actually are called Mishel Ha'av. They actually really reside in the sort of economic burden of the parent as opposed to the child. That expenditure of the child's own money to honor the parent is not what's called for by the mitzvah. Anyway, yet not being obligated to obey parents does not constitute permission to ignore them. In fact, the commandment not to ignore parents, here we're shifting to the, this is the kind of flip moment for Rav Shai. He really wants to develop and acknowledge that, mere or pure obedience is clearly not, within the halachic framework, a required dimension of the mitzvah, but don't misinterpret that, right? The commandment not to ignore parents and as they get older, not to cast them aside, arguably lies at the heart of the fifth commandment. Now we're going to get into his reading. Consider the broader context of the mitzvah. The Ten Commandments as a whole are addressed first and foremost to adults rather than children. After all, it would make little sense to admonish children not to covet or commit adultery. Moreover, the fourth commandment explicitly requires its hearers to have their own children rest on Shabbat. It would seem then that the central concern of the fifth commandment is with how grown children treat their parents. This is, by the way, I think a really important and sort of not obvious aspect of how we think about honoring our parents. So much of the discussion of honoring our parents is something we learn as children and kind of comes up in the context of our developmental years in our parents' home. But what Rav Shai is arguing is that the most kind of potent and the real thrust of the mitzvah has to do with our honoring our parents in our adult lives. Some argue that the mandate to honor parents is, at bottom, a command which protected parents from being driven out of the house or abused after they could no longer work. See that 110? Yeah, that's, again, some of the modern commentators, Childs and Fredheim. As Patrick Miller puts it, although the commandment is addressed to persons of any age whose parents are living, it was not primarily directed to children to tell them how to treat their parents, but to adults. This means that this commandment has in mind especially how mature adults are to treat their older or elderly parents. Certainly, how much the more so thinking about an era in the time of the Torah when life expectancy was shorter. Yes, people kind of were emerging adults earlier, but probably by the time they were adults, maybe their parents were already, in the next stage of life, although maybe not so much more so than now, also when people are having children later. Caring for the frail and infirm can be exhausting and enervating, and the Torah worries about the all-too-human temptation to abandon them. The fifth commandment thus focuses on the mature person, no longer under the control of parents, and now probably stronger than they are in every way. It has in mind elderly parents, the weaker and needier members of the relationship, who may be regarded by grown children as unimportant and burdensome. Noting that on his count of the Ten Commandments, only the fourth and fifth are stated positively, Walter Brueggemann suggests that perhaps this is meant to point to a deep connection between honoring parents and keeping Shabbat. We already saw that connection above being framed as Shabbat supersedes honoring your parents in the sense that if your parents tell you to violate a commandment like transgress Shabbat, you have to observe the Shabbat and not honor your parents. So the classic rabbinic association between the two is Shabbat as a kind of, superseding, in a sense, of honoring parents. Now we're going to see a different approach. He writes that the fifth commandment reflects parents who have by aging lost their productive capacity and therefore their social utility. If the circumstance in the command is that the parents have lost social productivity and so are made vulnerable, then it comes close to the Sabbath command that affirms that life does not consist in productivity. Shabbat is the celebration of life beyond and outside productivity. Taken together, then, the obligations to observe Shabbat and honor parents make a powerful, and in our own time urgently important point. Our worth as human beings does not derive from our jobs or from how much we produce, but from the simple fact that we are created in the image of God. By the way, this resonates for me in a different framework of parenting, which is the privilege I often have to have conversations. Stop the share for 1 second. The privilege that I often have to have conversations with parents who are expecting their first child or beginning on their journey of parenthood, who have such a particular definition or understanding of productivity as they've been engaged in their work or scholarly lives up until now, and just kind of helping them shift their expectations about how they're going to spend their time. And rather than thinking about it as, well, you're not really going to be productive, for the next bunch of days, weeks, months, because you're going to be completely consumed by nourishing and sustaining this little life, is actually to invite them to think about productivity in a different way. That's not simply about, what we yield in our work and what our brains produce, but also about our family privileges as another dimension of productivity. And so I think that's sort of what's being expressed here too. That our worth as human beings doesn't derive from our jobs or from how much we produce, but from the simple fact that we were created in the image of God. Okay, coming close to the end. In traditional societies, surgeon and writer Atul Gawande has recently observed, it was understood that parents would just keep living in their home, assisted by one or more of the children they'd raised. But in contemporary societies, all of that has changed. Old age and infirmity have gone from being a shared multi-generational responsibility to a more or less private state, something experienced largely alone or with the aid of doctors and institutions. There are many questions to be answered about just how and why this happened, about how much of it can and should be reversed, and about how that which cannot be reversed can nevertheless be rendered kinder, gentler, and more humane. Do not cast me off in old age, the psalmist prays. We repeat that refrain so often in the Yamim Noraim period in Slichot, right? Al tashlicheni le'et zikna, kichlot kochenu or kocheni al ta'azveni here in the singular. When my strength fails me, do not forsake me. A midrash imagines King David, to whom tradition assigns authorship of the Psalms, praying, "When I was young, I would go out to battle, and I gave my life for your children," right? You, God, your children. "But now that I am old, I have no more strength. And they say, until when will this old man go on living?" How to affirm the dignity of the elderly and ill is an enormous challenge, psychologically, sociologically, and economically. In many ways, we as a society are only at the beginning of a much-needed conversation on care for elders. One religious truth, at least, should serve as a touchstone as we move forward. To take the fifth commandment to heart is to understand that no one should ever be made to feel that we as a society are simply waiting for them to die. So that's Rav Shai taking us through Kabed Avicha V'Atimecha, creating the relationship between Kabed and Kal, setting this up as feeling the weightiness of our relationship with our parents and not making light of it, taking us through kind of a little biblical survey to see the different dimensions, the overall ambiguity, and then the question at a biblical level, does obeying our parents kind of figure in as part of honoring our parents? Surveying the halachic literature to see that, a sense of blind obedience at all costs and as against everything is certainly not part of honoring our parents. Certainly not at the expense of, other mitzvot of the Torah or even other dimensions of personal comfort, and that kind of thing. But there's no question that, and then moving from there, even if obedience in many cases is not prescribed by the mitzvah, that certainly does not diminish the way in which honor can be carried out. That figuring out exactly what that looks like is not so simple. And then moving to his approach, which sees the central piece starting with the awareness that this is a commandment directed primarily to adults within its context in the Ten Commandments, and therefore maybe its main application is about caring for aging parents. The beautiful reading of the juxtaposition to the commandment of Shabbat as about helping us broaden our way of thinking about relationships and life and the world as not just about our classical sense of productivity, but about affirming and honoring the dignity of people just as people, and how that applies to thinking about our parents in their older stages of life. The Midrash, which gives a sense of the kind of fear that older folks could have about being abandoned and not valued, and the reality that that's a very important and live conversation for our society today. So happy to hear responses. It could be more directly to the text and assertions here, or, this certainly touches on the personal for us as children, for us, as parents, and whichever dimensions feel live for us. So happy to hear. I'll start with Steve and then go to Lance.
Is this Rabbi Shai held?
Yes,
Someone
it
else.
is.
Oh, okay.
Steve, go ahead.
The word kaveh that you mentioned earlier, a weightiness to me, and I think this was covered later in that discussion, means a burden, maybe a burden upon the children to take care of parents, see to their resources. And so the weightiness is the weight that we feel as of an obligation, as well as a burden upon children. And as beautifully stated, it's a burden which we must incur, and that's part of the mitzvah.
Yeah, beautifully said. Maybe that the sense of weight is not just take it seriously, but somehow subtly the text is acknowledging that that kind of care imposes something and does burden, children in some way. And there's a way in which just naming that, honestly and forthrightly, helps us prepare to shoulder that. The Torah is not making light of what's expected, recognizing the weightiness of it. And so when we find ourselves feeling that, we know it doesn't have to always be that way for everyone, but if we find ourselves feeling that, that's not a reason to shy away from the mitzvah, but to recognize that we are probably experiencing what the mitzvah really asks of us. Yeah, thank you. Lance, go ahead.
I'd like to quote from Chaim Simon. Do you know him?
Yes, Professor Chaim Simon. Yes.
Simon, yes. Living God's will requires considerably more detailed knowledge of what the law mandates than a plain reading of the Bible lets on. To observe Shabbat, one must know precisely when it begins, when it ends, and what observing entails. Similarly, refraining from idol worship requires a refined understanding of what acts constitute worship and which belief systems are deemed idolatrous. The Talmudic sages held the laws of the Bible cannot be practiced until they are translated into more particular and detailed categories. In other words, for me, from my perspective, the Bible is a plot, series of plots. In other words, in order to have, you have the 10 Commandments. Why? To teach people how to behave? No. You have the 10 Commandments in order to become sacred fragments, in order to become the golden calf. You need the gold to be given to the Israelites as they leave Egypt. Why? Because you need that gold to build a golden calf. Now, it seems to me that everything that in other words, there's nothing wrong with everything you said about parenting and all this sort of thing. It's fine, but it's nothing to do with the Torah.
I missed the final connection. Say why, based on what you said up until now, why is it nothing to do with the Torah?
Okay, because the Torah is a story. It's a plot. And yes, there are laws, the priestly scroll, or whatever you want to call it, certainly is filled with laws, but most of them are having to do with the priest, with the temple. But what I'm saying here is the Talmud is an attempt to take what is found in the Torah and explicate it, put it into details that you can practice. You want to practice Shabbat? Well, here's what to do. You have 39 prohibitions or whatever, which, by the way, come from the prohibitions of the Kohanim, but we won't talk about that. But you need to have very specific details in order to be an observant halachic Jew. And that is nothing to do, I'm saying, it's great, it's fine, I have no problem with anyone wanting to live that way, but it's just that it is not necessarily worshiping God or believing in God or seeing God or whatever you want to call it. Because
I understand. If I understand, you're differentiating between the system of halacha and rabbinic interpretation as opposed to what's written in the Chumash, essentially.
right, I'm not doing that. Chaim, how do you pronounce his last name?
Amen.
Saman is saying that, but I happen to agree with him.
Yes, yes, I understand what you're saying. But and what I think is interesting about that is that Rav Shai does spend so much time on the commentators who are really building their case from internal to the Chumash itself, without before he moves to halacha, sort of saying, from within the Chumash, we don't have a lot of details, but we can start to develop a case of what it might be about. And yes, some of the most of the finer points are not clear at all in the Torah. Although I don't know if I would say they have nothing to do with it. I would just say they, like if we took the corpus, I guess I'll say it this way, if we took the corpus of the Shulchan Aruch and all the halachot that were, have developed about honoring one's parents, and we sort of presented it back to God at the time of the giving of the Torah and said, is this what you meant? I want to presume that I don't want to presume to know the answer to that question, meaning it might be that in this imagined scenario, in this thought experiment, God would say, like, yeah, obviously I wasn't going to write all those things in the Torah, but you're on the right track. Or maybe God would say, no, I think you veered kind of astray. Or maybe God would say, well, I didn't actually get into the details. So what you did is, if that's how you want to develop it and you think you're following the, overall broad strokes of what I laid out in the Torah, good work. So I think I agree with you that we can't assert that, the developed halacha reflects or is kind of unquestionably continuous with the Torah. But I also don't think we can, state with certainty that it is discontinuous or at odds with it. That's, I guess, what I would.
Well, let me just make another point here that Chaim makes, and that is that Jesus basically, this is what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying to the Pharisees, you guys are about picayune details, you're obsessive compulsive. And what we need is social justice. See, social justice is what we need. And that has nothing to do with, Talmud in a sense. I mean, you could practice social justice anyway. And the key here is, I think, that one of the ways of moving from the Torah to life is Christianity or Islam or Hindu. In other words, my house is a house of prayer for all peoples. That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And for those who are interested in Chaim Saman's work that Lance was referring to, it's his book Halacha, which is our current book in the Rabbi's Book Club. So a week from tomorrow night, we'll be gathering to discuss it in person. You don't have to have read the whole thing or really even any of it to come for the discussion. It's been a really, really thought-provoking read so far. So great. Bracha, go ahead. Thank you for waiting.
Interesting. I'm going off on a tangent, but the tangent has to do with details in the word. So I see a connection between the word and social justice in its details. If you look at the word kabed and you just juggle it a little bit, you get the word bekad, which means in a pitcher. So you can picture a pitcher of water on the table, but nothing is going to happen without your engaging with it and pouring for your parents some water. So that's where the details and the social justice piece comes in, that it's not just going to happen slapdash, that there needs to be consciousness and action directed towards it.
Beautiful. And indeed, it is the case that pouring drink for parents is one of the things that the Gemara mentions as the sort of specifics, and there are a number of stories, in particular about, the Gemara goes into a variety of, particularly pious ways in which children carried out honoring their parents, and I think one of them had something to do with a story. I'm not getting the exact details right, but the father asked for a glass of water and the son went to bring it, and when he arrived, the father had fallen asleep. The son just sort of stood there until the father woke up, so that he could be sure to, fulfill his wish in a timely fashion. So yeah, so the notion of the vessel and our interaction with the vessel, and sort of that sense that this command is a, something that needs interaction, the specifics of the relationship, in order to kind of be fleshed out, exactly resonates a lot. Yeah. Dan, please, and then David L.
I'd like to add that honoring parents is not only doing things for them to take care of their needs. It's allowing the parents to contribute, to feel, to have meaning to their own lives. And we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful notion. And I think that's at some level what, Rav Shai broadly, when he says at the end, affirming the dignity of the elderly. Again, not all parents are elderly, not all parents of adults are elderly, but affirming the dignity, I think means not just caring for, in a respectful way, but also supporting, the self-actualization and continued fulfillment, independence, engagement, meaning making, of parents. Absolutely. David L.
Thank you. So first, Lance, I think we have to invite you to one of Rav Shai's public lectures, and save it up, and he'll love the exchange. With regard to this essay, I think it's worth noting that Rav Shai lost his father at an early age, and I think that's an interesting insight in reading these words. And I would like to argue the other way, that actually caring for aged parents is the easier part than honoring one's parents when one's a teenager, however we want to think about that. The ability to step up and take care of people's needs is something really concrete and really clear, and it may be that part of the journey is an easier part than the earlier parts of the journey.
Thank you. Yeah, both salient points. And yes, of course, we are each in some way writing out of and influenced by our own experience. I've certainly heard Rav Shai, just going one step further afield, talk about people who, became second parents, surrogate parents to him. He doesn't go into that dimension of the relationship here about sort of how do we expand the category of parents. And, although in a sense he does, by, in the end, using this mitzvah as a jumping off point to talk about something broader than just our relationship to parents, right? I mean, I think one of the duties we feel as a shul is to be, in loco childis for people who don't have children, and how do we as a community ensure that they are cared for, honored. And of course, the other dimension of this that's doesn't really go into, but and the Torah, have to think about if or where it does, but the notion of also honoring our parents posthumously, and how we do that for people who don't have children is certainly certainly the Tanakh talks about that, right? The Sarisim and Venatati Bevetiu v'chomotai yad vashem, tov mi banim umi banot, and the idea of ways that we enshrine people's memories who don't have children. And I think there's a way in which Rav Shai is expanding the category of parents to kind of all people, at the end. So thank you for raising that. Back to Lance, and then anyone else before we wrap up.
What does the word hadar mean?
The word hadar,
Yes.
um,
Could it mean honor?
yeah, it could. Sorry about that.
Oh. And what is the
I think
central
I would go more
accomplishment?
I would go more towards something a little bit in the aesthetic realm, like splendor, something like that.
But isn't hadar the central accomplishment of Rav Shai's life?
The institute. I mean, I couldn't answer that question for him. Maybe his writings on Rav Heschel, Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel, hard to say, but certainly his role in creating and sustaining Mechon Hadar is definitely a huge piece of his contribution to the world already.
No, because it's interesting that he wrote this essay on honor, and of course the word honor in this essay is not hadar.
Yeah.
You see, which I find fascinating, but we'll let that pass.
Yeah. Great. Dad.
Thank you. I'm going to make an association with the word kibud with regard to Pharaoh. We just finished with Pharaoh not so long ago, and here this word is cropping up again. Pharaoh is being told to do something he doesn't want to do. So he is, in a way, strengthening himself to avoid something that he just can't do. And maybe for a child or even an adult child, may find it difficult to do these things that are honoring a parent, but knowing that it's something that he has to do, he has to like steel himself, strengthen himself and courage to do these things. So it's interesting how the same word is used in a positive way and in a negative way.
It's really interesting. Of course, even if I disagreed with you, I couldn't say so because one of the dimensions of Kibud Av V'Em, of Mora in the Gemara, is that you're not allowed to contradict your parents. So, but I agree with you. And I'll come to David L in a moment. Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting, that dimension. In our learning with Rabbi Linzer, we've sort of bounced back and forth between these kind of two poles, the way in which at one level, Kibud Av V'Em is so obvious, kind of what's the need for legislation, and then at another level, right? This actually came out in a discussion about the longer period of mourning for parents as opposed to every other relationship, and on the one, does it reflect a greater love? There's so greater grief. There are so many different dimensions of relationship and loved ones. And one of the arguments is that the extended period of mourning for parents reflects the fact that the relationship has a unique additional dimension, which is Kibud Av V'Em. And on the one hand, it's sort of so obvious. On the other hand, yeah, there are natural challenges and conflicts, and in certain ways, the halakha is there to say, whether you like it or not, whether you want to or not, this is incumbent upon you as an obligation, maybe even in the relationship in which it's most likely to feel complicated or difficult. Yeah. David L., back to you.
Difference in answering back your father or mother within a group as opposed to when it's private, a private conversation between child and parent.
Say it again.
Is the law about not contradicting your parent, does it apply equally whether you're talking to the parent in private or whether to your parent in a group like this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think there is further halachic development of that idea, but I don't have it handy. But it's an interesting question. Does it really have to do more with the realm of kind of embarrassing or kind of public contradiction as opposed to private conversation. My initial feeling about it is that's a distinction that like we might think about more than the halacha. So much of the halacha is sort of, as the afilu b'chadrei chadarim, right? Whatever we're expected to do, even in the most private of spaces. But it's certainly possible that there is that differentiation. Yeah, back to David Lowenfeld.
Yeah, Jacob, thank you for raising that, because I was thinking about that as we were reading the issue of kaved, and I want to offer an idea which I don't know if it'll hold up. But I think that God uses the Torah uses two languages. It uses the word vayechazak and it uses vayechabed. And I would offer just for the moment that one is that he strengthens the heart, and the other is he gives more weight to his heart. In one sense, I think that God is saying that he's giving Paro the strength to do the thing that's going to resist. And the other one, he is giving Paro a weightiness in his own spirit to do what his own heart initially would want him to do. But it would take a closer read to see if that really holds up.
Yeah, great. Very, very rich approach to the verbs. So thank you. All right, we'll close here, and gives us a lot to reflect on as we come to this mitzvah in this week's parasha and in general. And thanks to everybody. Look forward to continuing next week. Love, honor, respect, and reverence to mom and dad. And good night to all.